It's Friday the 26th of May, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh, Cardiff and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Susan Hume. On the programme this week, the Prime Minister decides Leila Braverman did not breach ministerial rules over her speeding offence. Labour says the government has lost control of immigration and issued too many visas to foreign workers.
The Prime Minister stood on 3 Tory manifestos. Each one promised to reduce immigration. Each promise broken.
Just this week, we announced the biggest ever single measure to tackle legal migration.
Water companies say stopping sewage flows into rivers could mean an increase in bills.
Their statutory duty was to build, operate and maintain sewage systems capable of effectively dealing with the contents of sewers. Now, we've paid the money for them to do that. The fact they're not doing it means that surely we're owed a refund.
Welsh politicians discussed the rioting in Cardiff that followed the deaths of 2 boys in a road accident.
Whoa!
And as dog attacks continue to rise, should owners be criminally responsible if their pet savages another dog?
Placing the responsibility for a fatal dog attack fairly and squarely on the person in charge of the dog and empowering the police to take action will have a deterrent effect, thus encouraging more responsible dog ownership.
Hello, thanks for joining us. Susan, now the subject of the Home Secretary Leila Braverman and her speeding points dominated this week. Just remind us what happened.
Yeah, so this all blew up over the weekend in reports that Leila Braverman had been caught speeding, and it was suggested that she'd asked civil servants about the possibility of arranging a one-to-one speed awareness course. Now, you won't know about this, but these are courses that you can do. Instead of getting points in your licence and a fine, you can do the speed awareness course instead, but normally as part of a group. So Leila Braverman said that she wanted to do a one-to-one course, apparently for security reasons, because once she became the Home Secretary, she always had a security detail with her. She'd asked civil servants about the possibility of that. Some suggested that she shouldn't have been asking civil servants any of that because it was a private matter, not something for civil servants. And the suggestion was that maybe she'd so overstepped the mark that that was a breach of the ministerial code. The questions about it came as soon as she stood up in the Commons for her routine session with MPs, but as you're about to hear, she very much stuck to her own form of words.
If caught speeding, does the Home Secretary agree that no one should be above the law?
Yeah. Last summer, I was speeding. I regret that. I paid the fine and I took the penalty. And at no point did I attempt to evade sanction.
At the heart of the Home Secretary's responsibility is to ensure that laws are fairly enforced for all. But when she got a speeding penalty, it seems she sought special treatment, a private course, and asked civil servants to help. She refused to say what she asked civil servants to do, so I ask her that again, and to also tell us whether she authorised her special advisor to tell journalists that there wasn't a speeding penalty when there was.
In the summer of last year, I was speeding. I regret that. I paid the fine and I accepted the points. At no time did I seek to avoid the sanction.
Speeding can affect a person's eligibility for leave to remain in the UK. So shouldn't the same motoring offence and indeed further breaches of the ministerial code by attempting to get special treatment affect the Home Secretary's right to remain in her job?
As I've said earlier, in the summer I was speeding. I regret that I was speeding. I accepted the points and I paid the fine, and at no point did I seek to avoid the sanction.
So lots of questions there for the Home Secretary, but by the middle of the week, the issue seemed to have died down. It received only a passing mention, didn't it, at Prime Minister's questions?
Well, yes, the Prime Minister had consulted his ethics advisor about it and had concluded that there was no need for an investigation into whether she broke the ministerial code. That news came out conveniently, I suppose, just before Prime Minister's questions, which kind of took the heat out of it. That was pretty much that, though Keir Starmer did pepper almost everything he had to say with plenty of jokes about speeding. The real meat of Prime Minister's questions, though, were the forthcoming net migration figures, which were already forecast to be very high, although they didn't know that the exact figures then. Keir Starmer talked about his policy, about what he would do, which would involve not allowing, in some sectors, overseas workers to be paid less than British workers. Rishi Sunak had already tried to sort of preempt those figures by coming out with a new policy saying that most foreign students would not be allowed to bring their family members here. And he also wondered why was Keir Starmer this week not talking about the economy on a week when he had some rather better news on that?
How many work visas were issued to foreign nationals last year?
Prime Minister. The most recent statistic we had, as the ONS said at the time, contained a set of unique circumstances, including welcoming many people here for humanitarian reasons.
They're not work visas.
The figures are out. It's 250,000 work visas were issued last year. He knows that answer. He just doesn't want to give it. And the new numbers tomorrow are expected to be even higher. The Prime Minister stood on 3 Tory manifestos. Each one promised to reduce immigration. Each promise broken. They all stood on those manifestos as well. Why does he think his Home Secretary seems to have such a problem coping with points-based systems?
Just this week, we announced the biggest ever single measure to tackle legal migration, removing the right for international students to bring dependents, toughening the rules on post-study work, and reviewing maintenance requirements. But what is the honourable gentleman's contribution? There are absolutely no ideas. There is absolutely no ideas, absolutely no semblance that there would be any control. Why? Because he believes in an open-door migration policy.
Under his government's rules, businesses in IT, engineering, healthcare, architecture, welding can pay foreign workers 20% less than British workers for years and years on end. Does he think his policy is encouraging businesses to train people here or hire from abroad?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, he talks about immigration, but we know his position because it turns out that Labour would actually like to see even more people coming to the UK, increasing the numbers. That's not just my view, Mr. Speaker. Those were the words of his own frontbencher who said having a target isn't sensible, and that the numbers might have to go up, Mr. Speaker. So it's clear, whilst we're getting on with clamping down on legal migration, listening to the British public, he's perfectly comfortable wanting to say that he wants free movement back.
His policies are holding working people back, and all he offers is more of the same. But fear not, because speeding into the void left by the Prime Minister comes the Home Secretary. Not with a plan for skills, growth or wages, no. Her big idea is for British workers to become fruit pickers. Just in case, I can hardly believe she said this, that they forget how to do things. Does the Prime Minister support this let them pick fruit ambition for Britain? Or does he wish he had the strength to give her a career change of her own?
Mr. Speaker, he talks about public service, he talks about the economy. Again, I think he's just failed to notice what's going on. The IMF, as they've said, it's right here, Mr. Speaker. Our forecasts, which he was very keen to point out just a few months ago, now their forecasts are that we will have stronger growth than Germany, France and Italy, Mr. Speaker. What do they say? They're saying that we are prioritising what's right for the British people, Mr. Speaker.
The Home Secretary may need a speed awareness course. He needs a reality check. This mess on immigration reveals a Tory party with no ambition for working people and no ambition for Britain. Just the same old failed ideas, low wages and high tax. Labour would fix the apprenticeship levy, fill the skills gap and stop businesses from recruiting from abroad if they don't pay properly. That's because we're the party of working people. What does it say about him and his party that they won't do the same?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think he said it 6 times, but I don't think we actually know how he's going to do any of these things, Mr. Speaker. And look, that's the difference between us, Mr. Speaker, because every week we hear a lot of empty rhetoric from the honourable gentleman opposite. But in the past week, we can measure ourselves by actions. What have we done on this side of the House? We've introduced new powers to curb disruptive protests. We're protecting public services against undisruptive strike action, Mr. Speaker, and we have new laws to stop the boats. What has he done? He's voted against every single one of those. And that's the difference between us. While he's working on the politics, we're working for the British people.
We learned today that the price of milk, cheese and eggs are up 29%. The price of pasta is up 27%. The price of a loaf of bread, 18%. Does the Prime Minister agree that this is no longer just a cost of living crisis? This is a cost of greed crisis.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Speaker, it was welcome that inflation has fallen today, but as the Chancellor said, we should not be complacent because there is more work to do. The honourable gentleman's right to highlight the impact of food inflation, which is too high, common here in levels that we've seen in other European countries like Sweden and Germany. We are providing significant support to help people with the cost of living, and the Chancellor has met with companies in the supermarket and food supply chain to make sure that they are doing everything they can to bring prices down.
So, Susan, there'd already been a lot on migration at Prime Minister's questions, but when the new migration figures were published on Thursday, there were further questions in the House.
Yeah, Labour had demanded a minister come. They wanted the Home Secretary. They didn't get the Home Secretary. They got the Immigration Minister, who cut quite a lonely figure on the green benches all on his own. The figures weren't quite as high as some had said, but it was over 600,000, which I think is pretty much a record figure. And Labour had some questions about whether the government had any plans at all that would really make a difference.
Net migration to the United Kingdom is far too high. That was already clear from the previous set of official data. The ONS have today amended their previous published estimate of net migration for the year ending June 2022 to 606,000. The statistics published today indicate that net migration has flatlined since then. The government remains committed to reducing overall net migration to sustainable levels. That is a solemn promise we made to the British public in our manifesto, and we are unwavering in our determination to deliver it.
Where is the Home Secretary, who is in charge of these policies? She's gone to ground. There are reports she's not even going to do media. She's not come to this House. She's in internal meetings, presumably more private courses arranged by the civil servants. What is the point of her? There has been no action at all to address the huge backlog in the asylum system and to make sure that claims are properly processed. Immigration is important to this country, and we need a system that works. But it has to be properly controlled and managed, rather than the chaos that the government has created.
Why is it that under the points-based system, we allow people in earning only $26,000 a year, but the median UK salary is $33,000 a year? Isn't an obvious solution to this to insist that everybody comes in, is skilled and earns the median UK salary, and then we can boost productivity and get British people back to work?
In some instances, high levels of net migration also place pressure downward on wages for the domestic economy and enable some employers to reach for the easy lever of importing foreign labour rather than training up their own British workforce. It's for those reasons that we created the points-based system that has a salary threshold, a freedom that we only have as a result of leaving the European Union. And if there are further changes to that system necessary in the future, we'll take them.
We have voted against the Nationality and Borders Bill and the Illegal Immigration Bill because we said they wouldn't work, and these figures show they haven't worked. So can he explain why it is that fewer than 1% of the people who arrived on small boats last year have actually had their asylum claims determined, and why is the figure so low?
Well, the honourable gentleman has voted against, or his party have voted against, every measure that this government has brought forward to control migration, whether that be legal or illegal. So his contention that the Labour Party would get control of migration is frankly laughable.
What my constituents want to know is what short-term plans there are, other than those that have been announced recently. What else is the department considering?
Well said.
Well, my honourable friend makes a number of important points, and I think few members of this House have argued more consistently than I have that we need to build more homes in this country, and there needs to be a proper join-up between the numbers coming in and the way we accommodate them.
The last Conservative Party manifesto pledged, and I quote, that overall net migration numbers would come down. So how's that going? What went wrong?
Yeah, well done.
Well, we wouldn't have the tools to tackle net migration had we taken the honourable gentleman's advice and remained within the European Union. It's only as a result of the new freedoms that we have that we can control our immigration system, and he has voted against every possible opportunity to tackle either legal or illegal migration. So I'm afraid he has no foot to stand on this argument.
A lot of focus on the Home Office this week. Susan, many thanks for now. We will be back with you later in the programme. But to Edinburgh now, and our Scotland political correspondent, Jamie McIver, who's at the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood. Jamie, the main subject at First Minister's questions was an admission of racism and discrimination in Police Scotland. What was said?
Indeed it was. Shortly before First Minister's questions, the Chief Constable of Police Scotland, Sir Ian Livingstone, made some very powerful comments to the Scottish police watchdog. He admitted the force was institutionally racist and discriminatory. A recent review uncovered first-hand accounts of racism, sexism and homophobia by serving officers, and heard of cases where staff had been punished for raising their concerns. Well, the Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross raised this issue in what was a very muted chamber.
A new report to the Scottish Police Authority raises a number of serious concerns about systemic issues throughout Police Scotland. The independent review found, and I quote, first-hand instances of racism, sexism and homophobia. In response, the Chief Constable of Police Scotland, Sir Ian Livingstone, has said this today. It is right for me as Chief Constable to clearly state that institutional racism, sexism, misogyny and discrimination exist. He continued, Police Scotland is institutionally discriminatory and racist. Can I ask the First Minister for his response to the Chief Constable's statement?
There is no doubt that institutional racism exists in our society. And I want to take a moment just to say that as a person of colour, the statement from the Chief Constable is monumental, historic. I remember raising issues around racism in the police force, Strathclyde Police as it was back then, when I was stopped and searched over a dozen times as a young boy, whether it was in my car or walking with my friends in the street or in airports at the time. And so the acknowledgement from the Chief Constable is very welcome indeed. I hope it also serves as a reminder to all of us that in whatever organisation we belong to, we have a responsibility to also question whether or not the organisations that we lead, certainly this is the case for me in the organisation that I lead, that we examine and reflect on whether we are doing enough.
Sir Ian Livingstone is due to retire from Police Scotland later in the summer. This was certainly a rare outburst of consensus in the chamber following Sir Ian's comments.
And Jamie, violence in schools has been under discussion in the Scottish Parliament this week too, hasn't it?
Yes, the Scottish Government is to host a special summit on tackling violence in schools, whether this is violence against teachers or violence against other pupils. The issue was discussed in a debate led by the Scottish Conservatives on Wednesday. Now, as you can imagine, this is an emotive issue and there have been some recent high-profile cases in Scotland, as well as allegations that some individual schools may have a particular problem. It's hard, though, to get a sense of whether or not the problem across Scotland is actually getting any worse, or whether it's simply the case that more examples of violence in schools are now coming to light. One particular issue of concern, though, is that some pupils may film these acts of violence on their mobile phones and then post the videos up on social media, adding, of course, to the distress of victims. There is that particular worry about whether or not the modern age can add to this problem. While exclusions from schools in Scotland, that's very much seen as the last resort. Well, Murdo Fraser from the Scottish Conservatives was very concerned about the issue, and he quoted from a communication they'd received from a primary teacher.
This isn't just an awful situation for the teachers. It is terrible for the majority of children who just want to get on and learn. Their life opportunities are being ruined by a small minority of disruptive children. The parents of these kids offer us no support, and in many cases simply don't have the skills themselves to deal with their own children. The parents of the other children in the school are up in arms about the situation. What is so frustrating is that we lack the tools to deal with the problem. We are not permitted to exclude children, and there is literally nowhere else for these kids to go, so they have to remain in school no matter how bad their behaviour. Getting it right for every child is an absolute joke. We are letting down the children who can't behave by not tackling the problem at root, and we are letting down every other child in the class who themselves are in fear of being attacked and cannot concentrate on learning.
I broadly recognise the point the member is making in relation to exclusions, having taught disruptive classes in my previous life. And so I do recognise how that can impact on others' learning. But I suppose my question to the member is this: is the answer that we have an increase in relation to the number of young people who are excluded? Is that actually an answer? Is that going to meet their educational needs? Or is there a better approach to how we can frame support for them going forward? Because I'm not necessarily sure that having a huge increase in the number of exclusions we currently have would be a signal of success.
The Education Secretary, Jenny Gilruth, herself a former teacher. Now, the issue of violence in schools touches on a broader issue, and that's the issue of how schools are recovering from the disruption to education during the pandemic. Some teachers would say that as well as educational problems, they're also seeing more examples of bad behaviour by children and young people, and more examples of children and young people who are less mature than you might have expected them to be by a particular age.
And Jamie, the row over the legality of the proposed recycling scheme rumbles on, doesn't it? They've been debating whether Scotland has the power to pass such a law. What's the latest?
Yes, this is the deposit return scheme. It's a Scottish Government scheme which has already been delayed until March of next year. Now, the idea may seem simple enough. There's a surcharge on bottles and drinks cans, but you basically get the money back when you bring the bottle or the drinks can back. But many businesses, especially smaller businesses, are very worried about how it may work out in practice. And another problem is that the scheme in its current form needs approval from the UK Government to go ahead. That's basically down to trying to get an exemption from the Internal Market Act, which is the act designed to ensure there are no barriers to trade across Britain. Now, the minister leading on this for the Scottish Government is Lorna Slater from the Scottish Greens, and she's warning that if there's no decision on that exemption by the end of this month, then there could be doubt over the scheme. Opposition parties in Scotland, though, they say the whole scheme has simply been a nightmare.
The faults with this disastrous scheme lie firmly at the door of the Minister's office. The shambolic rollout of this policy has damaged the relationship and confidence amongst Scottish businesses. And let's remind the Chamber that the thousands of businesses that have not even signed up to the SNP Green Deposit Return Scheme because they'll think it will be too damaging for their business.
Irrespective of who is responsible for compensation, can the Minister simply confirm that businesses, producers and retailers have incurred costs as required by law, and therefore, if the scheme fails, they must get compensation? Does the Minister accept that that principle is simply unchallengeable?
The question of compensation is a thoroughly hypothetical one at this point. I am working towards getting this scheme launched and making sure that the scheme is a success. And that is what we are putting in place towards the March 1st launch.
Now, the opposition parties in Scotland sense the Scottish Government may be preparing to delay the scheme again or even abandon it altogether, and then argue it's not their fault, but rather the fault of the UK Government for failing to provide that exemption to the Internal Market Act. Essentially, then, the argument is the Scottish Government would be turning it into a constitutional issue, trying to make out it's about the power of Holyrood to do what MSPs want to do, rather than the pros and cons of this scheme itself.
Jamie McIver, thank you very much. Jamie McIver at Holyrood. Now, back to Westminster. Susan, earlier in the week, the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was in Japan for a meeting of the G7 group of industrial nations. How did that go?
Well, I suppose it's one of the perks of being Prime Minister. Difficult job, but one of the perks is being able to go to interesting places round the world and stand shoulder to shoulder with other global leaders. That is what he did. He reported back to MPs on Monday. So there were questions about China, about Ukraine, about trade. Not so much about Home Secretaries and speeding fines. Everybody, I think, wanted to focus on some of those big global issues, including Keir Starmer, who, of course, he wants to be Prime Minister himself. So he wanted to look quite statesmanlike as well.
I want to address head-on a mistaken view that is heard too often. The idea that Britain is somehow in retreat on the world stage or that our influence is in decline. I reject that utterly. What we've seen in recent months is this Conservative government delivering the priorities of the British people and bringing our global influence to bear on some of the world's biggest challenges. Nowhere is that clearer than Ukraine. The image of the G7 leaders standing shoulder to shoulder with President Zelensky in Hiroshima sent a powerful message to the world: we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes.
As I told President Zelensky when I met him in Kyiv, whichever party is in power in the UK, there will be no let-up in Britain resolve. We will continue to support Ukraine's military and its people in their quest for freedom, for peace and for justice. China is increasingly aggressive in the Pacific. They show disdain for democratic values and human rights, and they are seeking to exploit economic leverage. A decade of ignoring these facts and Tory governments cosing up to Beijing have gifted the Chinese Communist Party a stake in Britain's key infrastructure. We need to change tack, and Labour is willing to work with the government on this. It is time for a full audit of UK-China relations and to work more consistently with our allies to develop a long-term plan for Western engagement.
He'll obviously be aware the United Nations has quite rightly condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Could he make any comment on the calls made by General Secretary Guterres to attempt to negotiate a ceasefire supported by President Ramaphosa and supported by the Pope? And what comment would he make about the statement made this morning by President Lula of Brazil? He's right that a ceasefire is not peace, but any peace process has to be started by a ceasefire. Otherwise, this war will go on and get worse and worse.
Prime Minister.
I could not disagree with the honourable gentleman more, Madam Deputy Speaker. A ceasefire is not a just and lasting peace for Ukraine. Russia has conducted an illegal and unprovoked invasion of another country. It has committed heinous war crimes, and the right and only response to that is for Russia to withdraw its forces from Ukraine. And all plans masquerading as peace plans that are, in fact, attempts just to freeze the conflict where it is are absolutely wrong, and they should be called out for exactly that.
Rather sobering reminder of the war in Ukraine there, but something pretty different also came up at Westminster this week, didn't it? The continuing problem and rather unpleasant problem of sewage leaks into waterways. There's concern about bills potentially going up, that customers could face higher bills to fix those infrastructure problems.
Yeah, well, I mean, there has been, forgive me, a flood of concern recently about these sewage spills. And just a week or so ago, the English water industry apologised for this, said sorry, and we're going to invest £10 billion on clean-up and replacing that rather crumbling Victorian infrastructure. Brilliant, said campaigners. That's just what we need. But wait a minute, who's going to be paying that £10 billion? Is it going to go on people's bills? And there was a lot of concern about that in the House of Lords.
Since the water companies were privatised, the water bills have soared by 40% in real terms. Investment has declined by 17%. £72 billion has been paid in dividends and another £15 billion possibly by the end of this decade. And now the companies are saying that they will make investment if they can increase water bills by another £100. I do hope that the Minister will exercise his considerable powers of persuasion on the water industry and insist that shareholders fund the investment and not customers, because they have already been fleeced for the last 34 years.
Yeah. Capital investment by water companies is 84% higher than it was before the sector was privatised. I've seen evidence that it is independently assessed that water bills would have been higher if we hadn't privatised the industry. £190 billion has been spent by water companies, paid for out of customers' bills, for investment in water.
Such is the size of the problem today that I think we must all accept that the strain will have to be taken by a combination of higher bills to the consumer, shareholders receiving smaller dividends, and I know that it's difficult for politicians to even contemplate this. I think general taxation, i.e. the Treasury, must also take a part in this burden.
Undoubtedly, we could resolve the situation by spending somewhere between 120 billion and 600 billion, separating out clean water from dirty water, retrofitting an entirely new sewage system, creating an additional 40,000 Olympic swimming pool equivalents of storage, and that would cost around between £271 and £817 per annum on bills.
We customers have paid the water companies all the money that they needed to do their job properly. Now, their statutory duty was to build, operate and maintain sewage systems capable of effectively dealing with the contents of sewers. Now, we've paid the money for them to do that. The fact they're not doing it means that surely we're owed a refund rather than paying more bills.
I'm not saying for a moment that there are not serious problems. This government is, if I can steal a soundbite, tough on sewage in rivers, tough on the causes of sewage in rivers, but we want to be absolutely clear that everything that happens comes at a price. We want companies to be able to pay out dividends, because that is what encourages companies to invest in our water sector.
Water bills include about £80 to cover interest payments. However, much of the debt is actually intra-group and is used to shift profits and dodge corporate tax. That much was acknowledged by Michael Gove in a speech on the 1st of March 2018. Can the Minister explain why the government has failed to curb customer and tax abuses by water companies?
What we have to ask ourselves is, what is the best model of doing that? And one that encourages investment into this country from sovereign wealth funds, from other countries around the world, as well as pension funds and investment base here, is surely a good way of doing it. So the model is right. The alternative means that the water companies will have to sit outside the Chancellor of the Exchequer's office in a queue behind the health service, the police, the armed forces, and does she honestly believe that there will be more investment through that kind of system of public sector borrowing rather than getting this kind of investment flowing into our infrastructure?
The House of Lords there discussing sewage leaks. Susan, many thanks again for the moment. But to Cardiff now, and our Wales political correspondent, Rhodri Lewis. Rhodri, the deaths of 2 boys in a road accident after being followed by police in Cardiff and the riots that followed dominated the week in Wales. What's been said in the Senedd?
Well, that's the issue, as you say. That's been a very sad story that's dominated the news all week here in Wales. The deaths of the 2 boys after being followed by the police and the riots which happened afterwards in Ely. We had an urgent question, an emergency question here in the Senedd, and it was asked by the Conservative leader, Andrew R.T. Davies.
There can be no excuse for the violence we witnessed last night on our TV screens and social media output. But what I would ask of the Welsh Government is what assessment has been made by the Welsh Government, along with its partner agencies, of the strength of community cohesion in the area of Ely, in Cardiff, and in particular the ability for those agencies to respond and work positively and proactively with the community to build the opportunities, install hope in communities, and ultimately make sure that residents in this part of Cardiff do not have to tolerate this level of lawlessness.
I would like to take the opportunity, along with the points that you've made, about thanking all those services and indeed the community itself, all those services involved, health, police, the local authority, fire and rescue services, for the exemplary way they pulled together to handle the situation. And I think it is a reflection of the excellent community safety partnership work that's been done in Cardiff, in that part in Cardiff, focusing on it last night. It enabled those services to work together so well in this fast-moving and tragic situation.
Jane Hutt went on to say that Senedd members will be kept abreast of everything that happens as the investigation continues.
And Rodri, our viewers will no doubt remember that the new Public Order Act caused controversy when it was used to arrest people at the King's coronation. Labour opposed it during its passage through the Westminster Parliament, but Keir Starmer now says he has no plans to repeal it. Are the Welsh Labour government taking a different view?
Well, this controversial act was used to arrest people at the coronation, an act that the Met Police now say that they regret, and critics say that it's too widely drawn and gives the police too many powers. Now, the Counsel General, McAntoniff, gave a statement on the implications of the Act for Wales, but UK Labour, as you said, won't commit to repeal it, which gave rise to this question from the Liberal Democrat, Jane Dodds.
Just be clear, Counsel General, that you will be calling on the leader of the Labour Party, should he become Prime Minister, to repeal this Act, and also Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, who has also said that he has no intention of repealing the Act. We really would like to hear that from Welsh Labour. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Well, thank you for your comments. I don't think I can be any clearer that my view is that all oppressive legislation that has been brought in by this government needs to be understood and it needs to be revoked. It needs to be repealed. I think that is one of the fundamental purposes of government, and particularly a purpose of a Labour government.
A pretty emphatic answer there from the Counsel General. One to watch, perhaps, as we go towards the next general election to see if UK Labour changes its mind.
And it seems the troubles of Wales's biggest health board are continuing. It's already in special measures, but what's being done about it?
Yes, I'm afraid so. The long-running saga over what should be done about Wales's biggest health board, Betsy Cadwaladr, has been discussed again here this week. It covers all of North Wales, of course, but like the Crimean War nurse after whom the board is named, it really has been in the wars after several critical reports, and it's now been put into special measures. Now, this week, Plaid Cymru reiterated their call for an inquiry into everything that's happened.
Isn't it time we had an independent investigation, an inquiry that can look transparently and forensically at what has happened in Betsy's past, so we can make plans for its future, but more importantly, for the future of those staff working in it and the patients dependent on it.
There are 20,000 people who work for the Health Board, and I've got to tell you that the morale of this constant criticism is really sapping their morale. Now, I'm not going to reorganise, Reen. That is not going to happen under my watch. So you can keep harping on if you want, but it's not going to change my mind. So I think you are undermining the people who you represent, the 2,000 people in Anglesey who are actually trying to get on with their day job. Now, of course, I'm happy to be held to account. I'm held to account on a weekly basis here. Very differently, let me point out, from the situation in England, where despite the fact that they have 21 hospitals in special measures equivalent. 21, never, as far as I can tell, has there been a question on the floor of the House in the House of Commons on any one of those. And I'm here week after week after week.
The Health Minister, Leila Nathoo, there, getting perhaps a bit cross and emphasising that she does make herself available for questioning regularly here at the Senedd. But there are so many strands to this story that I can almost guarantee we'll still be talking about it in the weeks and months to come.
Rodri Lewis at Cardiff Bay, thank you very much indeed. Now, finally, back to Westminster. Susan, it's been well documented this year that there's been a big increase in dog attacks, both against people and other dogs. One MP wanted to bring in new legislation on this. What would it do?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? One minute they can, in Parliament, be talking about Ukraine and the next about dog-on-dog attacks. And it's one of the things that makes it so interesting. A lot of people say that there is an increase in dog attacks. I don't know, putting it down to maybe a lot of people getting dogs during the pandemic, during lockdowns, maybe not very well trained, and a fashion for aggressive dogs. So a Conservative MP, Anna Firth, wants to see a change in the law so that dog owners whose pets kill other dogs can be prosecuted. At the moment, they can't. It's something that had been brought to her attention by a constituent who was actually there in the public gallery watching her making this speech, and it was the most distressing tale, I must say.
Companionship is the most common reason for having a dog, and that was absolutely the case for my constituent, Michael. Michael, who is with us today in the public gallery, lost his long-standing girlfriend unexpectedly and suddenly to epilepsy. So after her death, he adopted her beautiful, white, fluffy Bichon Frise bitch, Emily. 18 months ago, Emily was savagely attacked by an off-lead, out-of-control dog while on a walk through the Rose Garden in Chalkwell Park, Leigh-on-Sea. The dog came at Emily like a missile, and although she was on her lead, shook her like a rag doll. Michael found himself helpless to stop Emily being torn apart in front of his eyes. Outrageously, the owner of the dog that attacked Emily refused to take any responsibility, not even paying the vet's bill for euthanasia. I believe we would be doubly devastated if, on reporting the matter to the police, we were told there is nothing they could do as it was simply dog on dog. Now, laws, both civil and criminal, have been strengthened in recent years to protect the public where a dog presents as a risk to public safety, whether in public or private. But it remains the case that a dog owner is not liable to any form of criminal prosecution when their dog fatally attacks or seriously injures another dog, unless the other dog is a guide, assistance or service dog. Amending the Animal Welfare Act to criminalise fatal dog-on-dog attacks would extend the same protection to pet dogs that already exists for service, guide and assistance dogs.
Now, Susan, just briefly before we go, Parliament is taking a spring break next week. There'll be no proceedings, but what are you expecting when MPs come back?
Well, really what I'm expecting is what I don't yet know about, because in that week, of course, all sorts of things can happen. And what Parliament tends to do is react to that with those either statements or, more likely, those urgent questions that you get from mostly from opposition MPs, so that a minister has to come and talk about them. So we don't know what that's going to be. The other thing that is going to be coming up now, we're moving towards the summer, and all those bills, bits of legislation the government came up with last year are getting to the end of the toing and froing between the Lords and the Commons, where they try and refine it and make changes. They call it ping-pong, where it moves between the two houses as the Lords say, no, I think you need to tidy this up, and the government either gives in or tries to hold it up. It's getting quite late for some of those. Some important ones like the strikes bill is at that stage now. It's at the sort of end game for that. So that's what we'll be looking out for.
So lots to wrap up before the summer holidays. Susan Hume, many thanks for being with us today. Jo Coburn will be back with Politics Live on Monday the 5th of June. Until then, goodbye.